Welcome, everyone. We're going to get rolling here. Greetings. Thank you very much for coming. We can tell who's interested in politics. Everyone in the room. And we've got a big vote coming up here in Hungary. And here to discuss it, we were bringing in fantastic people to have a great conversation. I'm Melissa O'Sullivan with the Danube Institute. I welcome you on behalf of my colleagues, John O'Sullivan, President, Istvan Kish, Executive Director, Callum Nicholson, Research Director, who's going to be moderating the panel discussion. And at this moment, I'd like to call together our partner in this great event, Patrick Egan of Brussels Signal, and he'll have a few remarks to share as well. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to the Danube Institute for hosting this event and being a co-sponsor along with Brussels Signal. I am Patrick Egan, the founder and the publisher of Brussels Signal, one of the fastest growing English language news media outlets in Europe, covering Europe and the European Union, where we, in our mission, attempt to challenge the status quo of news coverage of European affairs, raising the questions that other media outlets are not interested in raising, talking to the sources and the people and covering the stories that other people are not interested in covering. And this evening, I'm delighted that we could have a couple of our regular contributors. Henry Olsen, you're going to hear at length from Henry in just a couple of minutes. He is in Hungary all week, not only in Budapest, but covering a couple of very important swing districts in the countryside. And you can read his writing at Brussels Signal, some fantastic coverage, not only of the Hungarian elections, but going back, a lot of really interesting coverage of European politics. Also, Ralph Schillhammer will be on the panel after Henry's remarks. Ralph is one of our regular contributors, a podcast host as well. These and other great writers on Brussels Signal. Don't miss a single column or a single podcast. You can sign up for our daily newsletter, Brussels Calling. Please do so. I would also like to thank personally John and Melissa O'Sullivan, the founders here, and the original motors behind the Danube Institute. You know, a lot of people have made comparisons between today's Budapest and Paris of the post-war years, the kind of the left bank atmosphere of the intellectual and cultural center that Paris was at that time, and that Budapest is somehow a little bit similar as a kind of a center, a mecca for people to come and be part of alternative thought that is challenging the status quo, similar to the way Brussels Signal is. And long before Budapest was the fashionable place to come that it is today, John and Melissa understood that there was something extraordinary going on here, and we're inviting people to come and see it for themselves. And they've really been pioneers in that effort. So thank you, John and Melissa, for all your hard work in that. And your hard work in that, and the fact that Danube Institute exists today, and that we can have great events like this. Thank you so much for that. Speaking of international scrutiny, just a couple of words about what's been going on here in Hungary over the last couple of weeks. I think it's fair that what we've witnessed over the last couple of weeks and months is extraordinary, remarkable indeed. It certainly surpasses anything that I've seen here in Hungary in terms of the elections, and I've been watching the elections here in Hungary since 1994, which makes me feel very old. That was a contest following the death of the first democratically elected Prime Minister, József Antall. And it makes me wonder why all the fuss, why all the scrutiny to Hungary. And I think the answer to that question we can find some clues taking a look at elections in Europe over the last couple of years. I would start with Romania in particular, a particularly, let's say, outstanding example. You know, in 2024, you recall, in November 2024, they held the first round of presidential elections there. It was subsequently overturned, nullified the results, by the Constitutional Court of Romania in December 2024. The winner of that election, that first round, Kálin Georgescu, was barred from running the election, the rerun of the election. The Constitutional Court cited intelligence declassified intelligence reports that alleged heavy Russian involvement, interference in the elections. By the way, you can read an outstanding account of the case that the Constitutional Court put forth, written by our correspondent, Gabriel Eleftheriou, who wrote one of the only English language accounts of what the Constitutional Court was claiming happened, and the title of that article is Zero Evidence. So that gives you a little bit of a clue of what Gabriel found there. But after Romania, there was also claims during the German federal elections. We had also the referendum, the presidential referendum, and subsequent parliamentary elections in Moldova, 2024 and 2025. We've seen recently in the Bulgarian parliamentary elections, I believe there was reports of the Bulgarian government actually reaching out to the European Commission for assistance with what they were referring to as interference in the elections there. And the claim in all of these cases was a familiar one: interference, disinformation, hybrid threats, often with allegations of Russian involvement to disrupt or support one side in the political contest. And what ensues then is action like the European Parliament's Democracy Shield, the new Center for Democratic Resilience, the rapid response mechanism of the European Commission, requiring social media platforms to exercise more moderation in the content on their platforms, all of which has serious implications for freedom of speech in Europe. And that's why we at Brussels Signal have taken, in our news reporting and our commentary, a very, very skeptical approach to a response to these measures that are being taken. So what has happened in Hungary over the last few weeks is, I think, even compared to these recent examples, exceptional, with allegations flying from both sides about heavy interference. We should all be asking ourselves what is at stake in these elections in Europe that is triggering this interference. I think it's fair to say that, without coming down on one side or the other about the veracity of the allegations from one side or the other, the principle of non-interference in the domestic politics of another country, whether that custom was respected or not at any time, it's certainly gone out the window now. And what we are seeing from a variety of different sides, various sides, and various certain political interests is a very, very active, assertive, and we dare say aggressive interference and attempt to affect the outcome of the elections. And we're seeing that with the Hungarian election today. Just to close real quick, I've gone on too long, but I went back to take a look at some video footage of a debate that took place in May of 1998, 28 years ago. It was at it was called the Közgaz Egyetem, the Economics University, formerly known as the Karl Marx University. And the debate took place between then Prime Minister and head of the Socialist Party, Gyula Horn, former Minister of Interior during the Communist era, and the young president of the Young Democrats, Fidesz, 35-year-old member of parliament by the name of Viktor Orbán. And they were debating one another after the first round of the elections because the two parties had come in, were the winners of that first round. It's charming to go back and look at that footage and see the innocence in that footage. But we see already the contest and the lines, the division in the contest emerging there as well. Gyula Horn, former communist, representative of the Communist International, and a leader of the Communist Party, and its successor, the Hungarian Socialist Party. And on the other side, an upstart, a challenger, a revolutionary, arguing very much for the national interest versus the international interest. And it was charming and fascinating to go back and look at that exchange today in light of everything that's gone on. I don't want to go on any longer. Once again, thank you to the Danube Institute for co-hosting this event. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And before I introduce Henry, I did want to recognize Mary Ellen Sinan. Where's Mary Ellen? With the Brussels Signals, part of the editorial brain trust of the Brussels Signal. So welcome, Mary Ellen. And so now we will go to our main speaker tonight, Henry Olsen. Henry is a columnist with the Brussels Signal, a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., host of the Conservative Crossroads podcast and Beyond the Polls podcast. And because he didn't think he had enough to do, he has now launched a new newsletter via the Washington Post every Wednesday called Margin of Victory. So anything you want to know about U.S. midterm elections, this is the place to find it. Margin of Victory via the Washington Post every Wednesday. Henry, thank you very much for coming to join us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thank you very much for the opportunity to come and chat with you. I first came to Budapest 10 years ago at the invitation of John and Melissa to speak before the Donald Trump era started, to talk about the American elections. And it's been wonderful to see the Institute grow and the city beautify. It certainly is a much obviously developed and wealthier place than it was 10 years ago. But of course, in politics, the question is always, what have you done for me lately? And that is the question that Hungarians will be asking of Viktor Orbán and the governing Fidesz KDNP coalition. So let me try and give you a few quick pointers of what it is that I'm going to be, points that I'm going to be raising. I'm not going to predict the election. I might offer some thoughts on that in a column that will be penned tomorrow, that will be published on Saturday. But I will not do so today. But I will tell you the things that I'm considering and things that I've learned both in my study and my time here. First of all, regardless of what you might want to say about the information space in Hungary, the voter will have more than enough information provided to know who they want to vote for and why. The voting patterns you will see will be largely the identical voting patterns that you see in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, and in developed countries around the world, and I'll go into details. You can rest assured that, again, whatever one wants to say about the information space here, the political space is open enough that this is going to be both a free and complete representation of what the Hungarian people really want, and also will reflect exactly the trends that we've seen globally over the last decade. Secondly, because of the hybrid nature of this system, the fact that you have single-member first-past-the-post constituencies and proportional vote, this will not be like a typical European election. Little things will matter, and those things include over-concentration of votes in certain areas and tactical voting. So when you're looking at who might win, don't simply look at the headline poll. What you have to do is really dive into the different constituencies and what their demographics are. And what you will find is that there's pretty rough agreement on which seats are going to be safe for TISA and which seats are going to be safe for Fidesz and which seats are up for grabs, and I'll get into that. But that question is crucial to understanding the outcome of this election. Third, and this is what I alluded to at the beginning with respect to the what have you done for you lately, what is the general climate against which the Hungarian voter will make their decision? And I don't just mean the political climate or geopolitical climate, but also the economic climate. It is not the same as in any election that Prime Minister Orbán has fought since he regained power in 2010. This presents difficulties, not unsurmountable ones, but challenges for a government that has been in power for as long as it has been. And then I'd like to conclude after telling you what, and after talking with people on both sides over the last few days, they agree on, and a surprisingly lot that they agree on as far as the contour of the election. Why this is ultimately going to be a stability versus change election and what that could possibly mean for the outcome. So let me first talk about the voting patterns. What we're going to see on Sunday is the rural areas with small villages and virtually no large metropolitan area will remain overwhelmingly Fidesz. It will have perhaps higher than normal share of vote for the right party, right populist, right-wing nationalist party, Our Homeland, Mi Hazánk, because that is the sort of constituency that they draw from. But this is going to be the safe Fidesz area. This is exactly the same pattern that you've seen in every Eastern European country that's held elections. That if you look at the Polish presidential election, the Polish website actually tells you by size of town who won the vote and what percentage. The smaller the town, the better the conservative populace does. The larger the city, the better Donald Tusk's candidates and parties do. It is an exact relationship. You will see a similar, although not quite as linear, relationship here. You saw it in the Czech election, cities going for the government, countryside largely going for the, various populist parties. You saw it in Slovakia, in Sweden in 2022. If you looked at the three largest cities and the Stockholm suburbs, the social democratic-led government would have been re-elected. The reason they lost is because there was a greater swing against them in the areas that most people never go to, the places that are the Swedish version of flyover country, literally, if you're taking a plane from Göteborg to Stockholm. And of course, we see the same thing, Australia, and the South Australian election that just happened a week or so ago. This is where you're going to see Fidesz strength, and it's going to be for the same reasons you see populist conservative strength around the world. What does that mean for TISA? It means the urban areas and the educated, well-to-do suburbs are going to be their area, because educated voters who may prefer a center-right old conservative party will prefer a upstart party that is more in line with international objectives and more in line with traditional or modern social mores and progressive or liberal social values. Budapest, I'd be shocked if TISA doesn't win all 16 districts in Budapest. That almost certainly means a Fidesz re-election. They will almost certainly take all of the inner suburbs. They will take the larger cities out in the countryside, like Debrecen. These are the areas that are swinging to the, what the populists call the globalist side or the liberal side. In America, you might call it the progressive side. This is, again, the sort of tendency that you see around the world. In the United States, it's the high-income suburbs that have moved from being for Mitt Romney, who now overwhelmingly go for Democrats. And the example I like to give in America is the example of Lee County, Iowa, a place that lost its famous pen factory to foreign competition and went from Obama plus 14 to Trump over 20 in the 2024 election. And Edina, Minnesota, a high-income suburb of Minneapolis that went from George W. Bush to narrow Obama in 2012 and went for Harris by over 30 points. High-income people who might prefer somebody from the center-right will go with the left to avoid the populists. Lower-income people who might prefer somebody from the traditional center-left will go with the populists to avoid the modern. This is what's going to happen here, and for the same reasons that it's happened everywhere else. Now, the thing, though, that we have to remember about Hungary is that it has the hybrid system. 106 of the 199 members will be elected in single-member districts, just like in the United States or in the United Kingdom. First past the post. You have 5 candidates, 7 candidates or so, and many do have 7 or 8 candidates. Whoever gets the most votes will win, regardless of whether it is a majority. The other 93 seats will be allocated according to a proportional vote, which is in fact much more complex than in other countries, and I won't bore you with the complexities. Suffice it to say that there are ways in which the exact vote will be counted. That means you can't simply say, well, TISA got 41% of the vote of the popular vote in polls, therefore they'll get 41% of the seats. No, it's much more complicated than that. But what that means is that everyone seems to recognize that no one will win the majority on the proportional representation votes. Virtually every poll, except the one outlier poll that suggests a supermajority for TISA, show that the two parties will be close enough that they can't get the majority from this mechanism alone, especially if the Nationalist Party, our homeland, breaks the 5% barrier needed to get proportional seats in Parliament, which most, not all polls suggest they will. That means the race is going to be decided by the 106 districts. And the place to look is the places that are between the suburbs and the big cities and the rural areas. Places like Veszprém 2 on Lake Balaton. Places like Cegléd, the large city in Pest 14, about an hour south of here. Places like Heves 1, where the main city is Eger, or Eger. Forgive my bowdlerization of Hungarian, which I don't know, and I've tried to at least avoid being terribly bad about it. These are the places to look. These are where the battles are taking place. This is where both parties know the election is going to be decided. And if you are following this, if you are a Western reporter who is following it and watching this, that is where you should look at. If you want to be a little geekier than that, you should play around with a mandate calculator on the website 24.hu that allows you to put in different projections of the popular vote, and it tells you what happens according to their calculations in each of the different districts. And by doing that, you will see which districts swing back and forth on little different projections. But when you have a system like this, what that means is that votes do not translate into seats perfectly. And for an American, what I'll remind you of is how Donald Trump could lose the popular vote in 2016, but win the Electoral College because the votes for Kamala Harris were concentrated in areas she was already going to win, whereas Donald Trump's constituency was spread out throughout the country, and he barely broke the blue wall and won. In Britain, you have the same phenomenon, is that anti-reform votes are concentrated in places like suburbs or cities, but the reform vote is well spread throughout the country. So they got very few seats in the 2024 election when they got 14%. Now that they're polling at 27%, every calculator says they would win a clear majority because their vote is spread. A little bit of an increase gives them a lot of seats. The votes that are against them are concentrated, and the fact that they might lose a suburban seat by 30 points rather than 10 points does not matter in the seat calculation at all. What this means is that TISA has to win the baseline proportional representation vote by somewhere between 4 to 6 points. Well, I knew I was saying some controversial things, but that's outrageous. By about 4 to 6 points in order to have a good shot at a majority. And that's because they will win a lot of these city districts by quite a lot, but they will not, they will be concentrated. They'll win Budapest by a lot of votes, but people who are voting in the Budapest district constituencies votes do not count in Pest 14 or Pest Prem 2 and so forth. You'll see this if you play around with the 24.hu calculator as well. So what this means then is that tactical voting and personal loyalties can make a huge difference. And where does this go? You see efforts on the left. There are two left-wing parties that are running national lists and also candidates in most of these districts, the Hungarian two-tailed dog party, MKKP, and the Democratic Coalition, DK. And you have TISA that is trying to tell those voters, the 2 to 6% of people who still would prefer to vote for a left-wing opposition rather than a TISA opposition, they're telling them, abandon these parties, don't believe them. Why? Because every vote that goes for these candidates, particularly in the first past the post single-member districts, is a vote lost to TISA. Fidesz, on the other hand, is trying to persuade the nationalist voters, our country voters, our homeland voters, split your ballot. Vote for Fidesz for the first past the post, and vote for the party you really want to vote for the PR seats. Why are they doing that? They're doing that to maximize their opportunity in these districts where every vote matters. You get 10 extra votes, 50 extra votes, 150 extra votes. That can be the difference between the majority or not. Both sides are doing this, and that could be a huge effect that we can't simply know unless we are literally doing polls everywhere or you are out in these areas talking to people and getting a sense of how much that's going to happen. So there's only a limited amount of what we can know from the polls precisely because of these factors. And then we have the question of the personal poll, that for a lot of these TISA candidates, they are not people who have been elected officials before. That's something that TISA wanted more of their candidates, people active in the community, but not people who have been members of other parties before or had elected positions before, which means they're less well known than many of their Fidesz counterparts. Does that mean that there will be a personal loyalty vote of 1 or 2% for the Fidesz candidate, the sort of person who says, yeah, I don't like Orbán, but you've delivered the goods for me. You helped my business get a loan. You built the school here. I'll vote for you. If that happens, that will help Fidesz. At least one person that I spoke to thinks that will happen to a small degree, that their polling suggests Fidesz running on average, not every district, not every person, a point or two ahead of the national standing and TISA running a point or two behind. We'll find out on election day. But that's, again, the sort of thing that in a race this close, in a race that decides on a first-past-the-post basis where every vote counts, that could be a deciding factor. Another factor to take into account is the overseas vote. There are two types of overseas votes. If you are a Hungarian who has no residence, Hungarian citizen who has no residence and has never lived here, typically national Hungarians who live in Serbia or in Hungary, in Transylvania, you can vote by mail, but only for the party list. These votes go overwhelmingly for Fidesz, and these apply to the 93. But if you are a Hungarian who has domiciled overseas but does have some relationship to Hungary, you can vote in person at the consulate or at the embassy, and you can vote for both. This vote is expected to go for TISA, and I was told today that the number of people who have registered to be able to do that has nearly doubled from the last election. These votes are then sent back after Election Day and counted after Election Day. So you should know when you're looking at things on Election Day, there's likely going to be a small but perhaps decisive pro-TISA element that will come in and be counted in the days after election. If there's 3 Fidesz members who are ahead by 100 votes and there's 1,000 votes coming in their constituency from overseas, that person may very well lose the seat because the votes are counted after Election Day. And that's why you have overseas election activity as well. But this is all interesting. It's the sort of thing that people like me really feed on. You can't possibly get too nerdy for me. But it's against a general climate that works against Fidesz. And this gets back to the question I started with. Fidesz came to power, again, in 2010, against the backdrop of the severe 2008 recession, against the backdrop of the Hungarian prime minister, the socialist prime minister being recorded and then having it leaked that he was lying to the Hungarian people about the economy, completely destroyed their credibility. And for the next 3 elections, Hungary largely produced a growing economy that produced low inflation and high real wages. So what you had was a party that represented the values of the Hungarian people and delivered economic growth. Well, what party in the world that represents the values of their people and delivers solid economic growth would you not expect to see reelected? But now, the last 4 years, you've seen that come into question. Inflation here has been higher than in the rest of the EU. You've had to resort to increases in the minimum wage and increased government subsidies to try and keep up wages and salaries for people, which puts pressure on business people who perhaps don't get a wage, so they don't get that benefit, but they have to pay higher interest rates and are exposed to inflation, and they're seeing a problem with that. GDP growth, real GDP growth, has been virtually nil over the last 4 years, below 1% over those 4 years. So you have economic stagnation. And then you have a new party that is no longer on the left, is that you used to have Orbán, Fidesz, who would run against a party or a collection of parties who were ultimately dragged down by the legacy of the Hungarian Socialist Party, ultimately dragged down by the representation of an urban set of values and a failed economic record that they could not overcome, whether or not people love Viktor Orbán. Well, now you're running against Peter Magyar, a former TISA member, who is proclaiming nationalism, who is avoiding left-wing social values, expressing himself in a way that he and his party represents the true nature of the Hungarian people. In fact, the very name TISA, the river that divides Hungary, is used by them as a unifying factor. We will unify, I heard him say at his rally in Sziget earlier this week. We will unify and bring together. They used the name of the party and the fact of the river to symbolize what they claim to be bringing. It means you can't run against him in the same way that you could run against the Budapest left-wing dominated opposition that was present in 2014 and 2018, and even in 2022, despite the best efforts to avoid that in the United for Hungary coalition. This means that this is a party that is more acceptable to the disgruntled Fidesz voter. And that is the core constituency, the person who would have voted for Fidesz, either because they would have seen the benefits when they became old enough to enter into the voting booth, the voting age, the 18 to 22-year-olds who have come of age, or the people who had been voting for Fidesz before but have seen the economy come into focus. They're finding it harder to hire their businesses. They're finding it harder to get contracts. They're finding it harder to put food on the table. The disgruntled Fidesz voter is one of the key factors in this race. How are they dealing with this? One of the things I want to note is that the fact that this exists does not necessarily mean that an incumbent party is going to lose. In 1992 in Britain, you had a conservative government that had won in 79 and in 83 and in 87 was going for their fourth consecutive race. It looked like they were not doing well because of the sense of stagnation and a sense of malaise. Maybe it's time for a change, but at the end, at the last minute, people decided to say, we're going to stick with what we know rather than jump into the abyss of the unknown. Have they changed enough was the question about Labour. And John Major won a victory that shocked people. That is what Fidesz is trying to do. Fidesz is trying to say, these people are risky. These people are unsafe. You can't trust them. And I don't know how many people here are Westerners who don't read Hungarian. I do not, but I've had a translator with me and who has shown me how many times this symbol is used. These words, these pictures in the billboards of Zelensky and Magyar, and the word over it is dangerous. Fidesz, it's Fidesz, the only safe choice. Security. In the dangerous world, you can't take the risk. That's the victory. That's the sort of thing that paid off. It paid off for Barack Obama in 2012. It's not like he entered 2012 after a massive recession, after a massive midterm defeat with a massive support, but rather he convinced people that Mitt Romney didn't share their values and was not the person to lead the country. So he used the idea of this change is too risky. This change does not represent your values to win a re-election that if you had asked most Republicans 9 months before, you would have been laughed out of the room. In fact, if you asked Republicans the weekend before, would Mitt Romney lose the election, you would have been laughed out of the room. I didn't think so. I thought Barack Obama would win, and that jump-started my career. But I digress. So it doesn't mean that he will lose, but it means you must address that. And of course, TISA is saying it's time for a change. There's corruption, there's this, there's that, we can fix it. If voters want change, you should expect TISA to win. If voters decide, despite everything, they value stability, then you should expect Fidesz to have a narrow victory. And that gets to one of the points I want to make, and that is what the two sides agree on as to what the contours are. And I've talked to pollsters on both sides, I've talked to experts on both sides, and it is interesting. They all agree that we will see a record high turnout. Some say 74%, some say 75%. The record high turnout is in 2002 of 70%. So both sides agree that more Hungarians as a percentage of eligible voters, and they have automatic enrollment here for the non-Americans in the room, so adults is the same thing as registered voters, 75% turnout. That's a massive turnout. Even by Western European standards, that's a massive turnout. It's like 20 points higher than the most recent Portuguese elections, by a matter of fact. They both agree that the median TISA voter is more engaged and likelier to vote than the median Fidesz voter. That gap has narrowed, they both agree, throughout this campaign, but it remains, as I speak, slightly lower for the average Fidesz voter than for the TISA voter. That, again, in a first-past-the-post, in a proportional representation system, that's a rounding error. In a first-past-the-post system, that could be the difference between majority and non-majority. They also agree that there's a rough equality between the blocs. And what I mean is that, yes, you have polls that say Fidesz is up by 6 or that TISA is ahead by 9, but those are based on different assumptions about turnout rates, how undecideds might move, and so forth. What they agree is that the core support is roughly equal. And that's an interesting thing to learn. They also both roughly agree that the left-wing opposition parties will not break the 5% barrier to break it into parliament, and they will only get a couple of percent of the vote, whereas the right-wing opposition party is likely to get 5% and get the proportional seats, and could do even better than that, particularly if the disgruntled Fidesz voter decides to vote for somebody closer to their ideology, but not for Fidesz. And they also agree on the share of people who remain undecided. That's another thing that for Americans, we always see polls X, Y, and undecided. Most of the rest of the world excludes undecideds. They only give you the numbers of decided voters, and that is every poll that you read, the headline figures are only of decided voters. So what is the share of the undecided voter? Both sides agree, 6, 7, 8%. In a tight race, in a first-past-the-post system, that matters. If both sides are roughly on the same, one side has a slight turnout advantage, but that's closing fast, how this 8% swings over the next 4 days in the first-past-the-post system could be the difference between losing Vesprem 2 with 41% and winning Vesprem 2 with 43%. So that raises the last point I want to bring, and that's the stability versus change. And this gets to the question that I raised with 1992 in Britain. You can see in situations like this very quick and rapid shifts that aren't picked up by polls. In 2016, if you listen to the polls, Donald Trump was going to lose. He wasn't going to lose because he was going to lose the Electoral College, but he was going to lose the popular vote by 4, 5, 6, 7 points. He didn't. He did lose the popular vote, but he didn't lose it by that much. Why? It's because over the last 5 days before election, the undecided voter and the person who thought they were going to vote a protest vote for a third-party candidate decided that they had to make a choice. And they swung overwhelmingly to Donald Trump. The people who voted for stability, swinging to major in 92 against the bulk of polls, swung to Trump for change against Hillary Clinton in 2016. It's the same thing that we saw in Brexit. Almost every poll said that the referendum was going to lose. Of course, they excluded undecided voters. What did you see? A high turnout, higher than expected voting among Brexit-friendly, low-engagement voters, low-education voters who came out and decided the risk was worth it, surprising the British establishment. Don't be surprised if that 8% swings 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 in one direction or another. And in a first-past-the-post system, that can be the difference between 95 seats and 110 seats. If they want change, then expect TISA to outperform, not the median poll, maybe not even some of the other polls, but expect them to outperform the Fidesz expectations and expect them to get between 105 and 115 seats. If those voters split, or if they prefer stability, then you should expect Fidesz to win a narrow majority. But whatever you see on Sunday, these are the factors that will be at play, I believe, and what you will see is a fair and legitimate expression of the Hungarian people. Because as much as it is different than the way democracy is practiced in many Western European countries, this is a democracy. People do talk. They are free to talk. Both sides agree that the voting system is fair, transparent, and there's not going to be ballot box stuffing. What you see is what you get, and whoever wins will represent the real expression of the Hungarian people.
And now that Henry set the table, I'd like to call Dr. Callum Nicholson to the podium, who will introduce the panelists for this discussion part of the program. Thank you, Callum.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Having heard that, and it was fascinating, thank you very much. We have a packed panel for us tonight. Obviously, Henry's on the panel, but he'll be joined by, first of all, the president of the Danube Institute, John O'Sullivan, and by the executive director of the Danube Institute, István Kiss. They'll also be joined by, from MCC, also a columnist for Brussels Signal, Ralph Schollhammer. And last but not least, we're also very honoured to have with us a friend of the show, friend of the Institute, John Fund, a columnist for the National Review and contributor to Newsmax TV. Thanks, John. Okay, and we're short, I think, one microphone, so perhaps you may have to share, maybe Ralph and John. Okay, so first of all, I thought we might start. I want to keep these questions fairly general and let you guys move within those questions. But does this election feel different from previous ones? And this is a question with two elements to it. One is almost locally, particularly to István, I think, as a Hungarian. You obviously have seen a lot of elections in Hungary. Does this one feel different? And also, to the international members of the panel, looking internationally, is there something about this election that stands out in particular? Perhaps István first.
Thank you, Callum. But I think it is. So it's hard to deny that I think this is the most competitive election we had in 20 years, basically. So in a sense, there's much more tension, much more... I would say tension coming from both sides because and kind of a feeling that so look, for me it's kind of a new feeling because I saw this in America, I saw this in Western Europe, kind of this fragmentation of society and this kind of a clash between left and right and people not talking to each other because somebody votes for a party. I didn't see that in Hungary until I would say 2 years when TISA party kind of emerged, and I'm not saying it's only the fault of TISA party, but it's certain that in my personal experience things did change and this kind of politics destroying friendships and family kind of come to Hungary as well. I don't think it's as bad perhaps as it is in, let's say, America, but it is kind of a new thing which I didn't experience before, and perhaps it is because we have a very competitive election cycle now. So I think various differences, and I would kind of put it down to mostly to this, that it's a competitive election. Of course, as Henry has mentioned, it is true that previous elections, Fidesz was lucky because the economy was doing very well. So after 2010, and before that the socialist governments did a terrible economic policy, afterwards Fidesz and Orbán managed to turn that around, and every election people felt, the vast majority of the people felt that they are living better than they did the previous election. Now that's much more divided, so it's kind of half and half. That's a new thing. And also it's kind of new, I think, in the sense that Fidesz had very strong messages, and you have a strong message today as well. But in 2014 it was basically the utility cost thing. In 2018 it was migration. In 2022 it was the war. And now you again have stability and the war, but it's not as new as it was 4 years ago. So there's a lot of kind of differences, as you might see. And again, one thing which we kind of undefine as a new thing is that the opposition is much less divided as it was for 20 years, basically. So Péter Magyar was very effective in kind of showing that he's something new and convincing most of the left-wing voters that they have to vote for him if they want change, because all the other votes are basically votes down the drain. It didn't succeed with all of the parties, but it did succeed with most of the left-wing parties, and that's also a new thing because previously the left-wing vote was more divided. I mean, we will see. We have the Democratic Coalition as a left-wing party. We have the Joke Party as a left-wing party. They are running in more than 70 constituencies, so they might take away some part of the left-wing vote, but certainly we don't have as much as we did in the past.
Thanks, István. John, you're not a Hungarian, but you've been here a few years now, since, 2013, I think. What's your impression? Is this different? Does it feel different?
Well, I think the most remarkable thing about it is this is the first post-left election. I mean, the last election, the coalition that was assembled was led by a conservative, but it was still seen as very largely a coalition in which the left was powerful, important, and would exercise authority in government. That's not the case in this election. In a way, the coalition that's been put together to form TISA is one in which has been, looks to me like very much orchestrated and shepherded by the European People's Party. This is the party of the Christian Democrats in other countries, and in a sense, I think they want to have a party here, which they used to have in Fidesz, but Fidesz fell out with the EPP. So now this is, in a sense, a very big deal. First of all, it means that, as previously happened in Poland, the left somehow just disappeared. It obviously is not... there are still people who are in left-wing parties and governments in politics, but somehow they lack the ability to assemble a strong coalition. In the case of Poland, that led to a period, this is now going on for 15 to 20 years, in which the left has gone, and you really have a party system which I would describe as like urban Whigs versus rural Tories, going back to 18th century politics. In this country, something similar seems to be happening. So you might say, if I were looking at this from the standpoint, let's say, of Viktor Orbán, I'd be saying, well, I've achieved one really important thing. I've defeated the left once and for all. Of course, once and for all is never true in politics. Things can always change back. But the second big impact of this, it seems to me, very simply is this. What we have had is an election campaign in which the degree of antagonism and bitterness has been quite disproportionate compared to the differences in policy. The ideological differences are really very small, because one of the principal arguments of TISA is, well, we certainly are going to carry on being resistant to Europe to a lesser extent, maybe. Yes, we're not going to change the policy on migration. We're very happy with that, and so on. So you have this very odd situation in which really bitter arguments are being put by both sides, and a kind of what I'd call a shadow election campaign between intelligence services, we're making wild allegations against each other, has been going on, and that, it seemed to me, has been a real distraction. But I think perhaps it's been a distraction less for the voters, particularly in the countryside, than for the foreign correspondents and Brussels and others who would obviously like to see a change here, and who have been, in a sense, they have been not only the producers of this second election campaign, but I think this is fortunate, very largely its audience as well.
I have to say, John, that you're famous for O'Sullivan's law of any institute that is not explicitly right-wing will become left-wing over time, and I wonder if the opposition is the first case against that of becoming right-wing over time in this case. But moving on from that, to Ralph, you're from Vienna. Yes. You must have been paying attention closely to Hungary for decades. You live here now, I think, part-time. What's your take?
I was just, I think I came across this a couple of days back from the last election campaign 4 years ago, where the opposition leader said very enthusiastically, look at our alliance, we have everybody from fascists to communists. And not surprisingly, they lost the election after this, because this is usually not something that you want to endorse. And I would argue there were two kinds of campaigns going on. So there was I think Henry kind of outlined it quite beautifully. So you had the domestic campaign in Hungary, where I would argue that the opposition tried to paint themselves as actually not being that different from the ruling party, just in some small areas, but basically they're also conservatives. They're just maybe even purer conservatives, or they're the fresher, the newer faces of conservatism, but they did not define themselves necessarily as left-wing. And then you had like the other campaign, which took place outside of Hungary, where the argument was, okay, this is going to be a 180-degree change. So if there is a new prime minister, this is going to be completely different. So this is going to be, it was interesting to observe that you had this internal Hungarian campaign and this external Hungarian campaign. And of course, and we heard it earlier today, I mean, the Hungarian electoral system is exactly what you would expect it to be in a country that invented the Rubik's Cube and had several Nobel Prize winners in mathematics, right? This is precisely how you would design it. But even from a more international perspective, because you mentioned Austria, where I'm from, despite the government or parts of the government openly supporting the opposition, there are, let's say, quieter voices who say, what happens if there is a government change in Hungary and we can no longer hide behind Viktor Orbán? Because there will be a great surprise throughout the European Union that many of the positions taken by the current Hungarian government are not publicly but secretly shared by other governments, and they then can no longer hide behind Hungary. So will they then come to the forefront, or who is going to be, quote-unquote, the new Hungary if there should be a change in government?
Thanks, Ralph. John, fun, that is. Obviously, it's not your first time in Budapest, of course, and you've spent the last few days, I think, also observing the election up close, or the campaigning. What do you think is going on? Does this feel different to you, even comparatively to elections you've seen elsewhere?
Well, along with Henry, I have observed with great interest and to some extent pride how much progress Hungary has made on many levels. I'm old enough to have been here in 1989. I arrived at the site of the Pan-European picnic only a couple of days after the famous border crossing. So I've seen Hungary in sort of flash form every few years and how it's changed. Let's compare it to the 2022 election. There's an old saying that it's important not to fight the last war. And I think too many people, especially the foreign media and a lot of international observers, are fighting the last war. This election, after a party has been in power for 16 consecutive years, involves, I think, a fundamental issue that many of the people in this room don't think is the fundamental issue in this race. We're sitting in a neighborhood in Budapest which is just about the wealthiest part of Hungary. Housing here, 7,000 to 8,000 euros per square meter. It's a lot of money in this neighborhood. So the election, though, is not being fought by people who live in this neighborhood or even in Budapest. It's being fought across the country. And for many of, or most of those people, the election is not about Ukraine. The election is not about Brussels. The election, not so much about corruption. The election, not so much about J.D. Vance arriving. It's not about the family even, or migration. It's about, in part, what Henry said, what have you done for me lately, and what's the state of the economy? And that is Fidesz's fundamental challenge. I came in the spring of 2022, and I interviewed a whole bunch of people, many people in the government, and they explained to me in detail their policies, and they also explained where they were going. And I think it's fair to say that things didn't quite turn out the way that they had hoped. Hungary, in the last few years, has had inflation twice the rate of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is not run by very competent people. The economy has basically been stagnant for over 4 years straight. Basically no growth. Yes, there's been some job moving into the country. Mercedes is bringing some new workers in. I'm not discounting that. But for the average Hungarian, they've been standing still. They've not been moving forward. Now, I've looked at a lot of elections in Europe and other advanced countries. What happens when a country is in stagnation? It becomes very difficult for the incumbent party to make its case unless it has something new and fresh to talk about. And what I've observed here, and also been told by others, that part of Fidesz is fighting the last war, which is warning the electorate of the dangers of a change and the dangerous people that are behind the opposition and all the things you have to worry about in terms of Brussels or international interference. But that's not what most people in the end will vote on in the voting booth. They're going to vote on, will their lives be better? And right now, I think they're in jeopardy of thinking that we could do better. And I'll say this about Viktor Orbán. In 2014, at a speech at one of the major conferences of Fidesz, he predicted the state of the Hungarian economy in 10, 15 years. If you look at that speech today, in that one area, and I'm not saying in the other areas, I think he has had signal successes in migration and other areas. In that one area, he has fallen short. Hungary, if you compare it to Poland, the comparison is not in his favor. If you compare it to other countries in the region, Hungary is lagging behind most of them, with the possible exception of Slovakia. This is a real problem. Why are we not doing better? And I would submit there's one possible reason that is not talked about much. Viktor Orbán is a man of action, and I'll tell you a quick anecdote. A few years ago, he was sitting with his cabinet, and he was changing his economic ministers, and somebody said, well, why are you doing this? And he said, I don't like economists that I'm having around me lately. All they do is tell me what I cannot do. I'm a man of action. I want people around me who'll tell me what I can do. And that became unorthodox economics. You've heard about the illiberal democracy. Well, there's also unorthodox economics. The problem is this. If you have tactical maneuvering and unorthodox changes in traditional economic policy often enough, that becomes a new orthodoxy. And that's what we're in danger of having. And an economist recently that I interviewed sat with the Prime Minister and told him, Mr. Prime Minister, I really fear that you have confused people, not only abroad but here, that your economic program is not predictable and it's constantly in motion. And it always has some new twist. And Orbán dismissed him and said, look, I know my country, I know my people, and I have to tell you, you don't understand. I always have something up my sleeve. I have many tricks up my sleeve, and you can't possibly comprehend what they are. And the economist said, Mr. Prime Minister, I fear that, yes, you have had many tricks, but I think you've run out of sleeves. And I think, just to conclude, the unpredictability of Viktor Orbán in some of his economic policies has not been necessarily unorthodox economics. It's been economics that has held back the country in some respects. And whether or not he is reelected for going on, it'll be 20 years consecutively, will be if people think he has a plan they can understand and follow, or whether or not they think it's just another set of improvised policies.
Thanks, John. So I just want to pivot to the next question, but let Henry have the opening comment, because it links to this, really. Where I was going to go is precisely the question of, what will decide this next election. I mean, Henry, you were talking about where the election will be decided and how tactically, but the question of what are the issues fundamentally that will decide things. I mean, of course, this week we had a very long motorcade snaking across town back and forward, which intercepted me at least twice. Of course, J.D. Vance was here. And now that would suggest that international factors, international sort of voices and testimonials and so on will decide the election or help. But there's a big question. Does that really move the needle, or is it purely domestic issues? Is it just the economy and so on? So, Henry, you've spent a few days around town and around the country. Begin with you and then move to István. But what is your sense of the issues that fundamentally will decide the election?
I think the issues that will fundamentally decide the election are you more afraid of what, I think it will crystallize into, are you more afraid of what the opposition will do with power, or are you more afraid of what?
It's about risk, really.
Risk, yeah. And that's what the government's trying to play, is that if you will lose national sovereignty, you might see Ukrainian interference, not just Ukrainian interference, you might see Hungary will get dragged into the war with Ukraine. You'll see, a lack of. They have one flyer that they're handing that talks about all the tax increases you're supposed to see. They'll increase your income tax, they'll increase your VAT, they'll increase your utility bills, they'll increase your electricity bills. I've got it in my briefcase over there if people want to see the flyer that's being handed around. So that's what they're saying is that's a risk. That's the risk you have to worry about. And the other argument is, no, the risk you have to worry about is what you're seeing right now, is economic stagnation, your country falling behind, and I think the voter in the middle, the voter who will decide, is going to decide which of these arguments they see as being more persuasive. I don't know which one they will choose, but it'll be all of the individual issues coming into that basic question. And that was what Ronald Reagan talked about in 1980, when he too was coming against the backdrop of a failed presidency. People knew they didn't want Jimmy Carter, but they didn't know if they wanted Ronald Reagan. And there was a 2 months campaign where Carter tried to say, be very scared of Reagan. Reagan wants to do this, Reagan wants to do that. He's a warmonger, he's a divider, he's a racist, he's this. Tear down the welfare state. And Reagan deflected that in his famous debate and summed up by saying, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is America more respected in the world than it was 4 years ago? And that crystallized everything. And the American swing voter, which was about 20% of the electorate, decided this person is safe enough, we'll take a chance on him. And you saw a 10-point move in the polls in 5 days. And I think all of those issues will come down to that one question, and we don't know which way people are going to go.
So this is very interesting. So we've heard on the one hand, quite in a sense, an economic reductive argument in terms of what will decide it, and you're saying that there are risks that expand to issues around respect in general, more of a disposition. István, so you're the Hungarian on the panel. What do you think?
I think it's both. So obviously, I think the economy is important. So it's the economy stupid, as Americans say. But I don't see it as bleakly as John sees the Hungarian economy. So it is true that the past 4 years hasn't been the best for Hungary, but I think the tendency, especially in the past 1 year, has been better than it was before. So, and I think voters decide on the tendency and kind of the feeling they have, and not necessarily about the actual numbers. It depends, how long the memory of the voters is. So we will see. But I think if you look at the actual economic numbers, it's been doing better in the past year than it was obviously after the war broke out and the first 2 years after the Ukrainian war. That's true for inflation, that's true for economic growth, that's true for things like the battery factories, which seem to be turning up again and producing. So that's going to be a question how voters see that, what is their memory in economics. But I also think that because, the economy is not doing very well in the whole Europe. So that's another thing you have to figure in, and people sadly know that, and they do compare. But also because we see this instability increasing in the world, I think stability will play an important role, and that's why it makes sense for Orbán and Fidesz to play on that, because on the one hand you have a leader who has 16 years of, actually 20 years of experience, because he was prime minister in the 90s as well, and I think that's why the GD Vance visit might help, who personally has a good relationship with most of the big world leaders, from Trump to Putin to Xi Jinping, but also other leaders like Meloni or Milei, who was here for CPEC. So on the one hand, you have a person like that who people pick up the phone and who a lot of different people trust. And on the other side, you have somebody who you didn't really try. So I think in this situation where you have the crisis in the Middle East, you still have the war in Ukraine, stability might matter, and people might go with the devil they know instead of the devil they don't know. And kind of just thinking, 4 years ago, most people, I think, even near Fidesz, thought that Fidesz will lose most of the agglomeration. So not just Budapest itself, but also the agglomeration of Budapest, where you have usually, I mean, you have some rural areas, but a lot of the people there are the people who actually moved out from Budapest, kind of middle class, upper middle class, not necessarily very conservative, but they did benefit from the family policies because most of them paid much less tax because we now have a flat personal income tax. Some of them have, 3 kids, 4 kids, again, benefited from these policies. And in the end, they did vote for Fidesz because they were afraid that if the other party wins the kind of ragtag coalition, then they will lose those benefits. Now the question is, will they again, in the very last minute, decide by this? Will they be afraid? Because although John was saying Tisza is trying to, especially Péter Magyar, trying to portray himself as somebody who's on the right and, kind of a new version of Fidesz. Actually, the people he surrounds himself with, and we have several of these video messages and sometimes actually public events where we're talking about their plans, they are on the left and they were saying pretty damaging stuff, like actually getting rid of the flat personal income tax. So, in a sense, I don't think the left has disappeared because a lot of the advisors and kind of the background intelligentsia of the left, economists, cultural people, are actually near Tisza and giving advice to Tisza now. And that could be problematic because, where you have these videos, they are very openly talking about these things. So I think it's going to be, yes, the economy, but I think it's kind of much more, how should I say this, complex when it looks at first. And I think the other one is actually stability and also kind of the uncertainty of what the other party will mean because they sometimes say nice things, but will that happen? You're not able to interview his people. He blocked them. So the only thing we know is his speeches where he can say anything. So I think it's hard to make an informed decision when your members of parliament you want to elect are not allowed to give interviews to media, and not just Fidesz media, any media at all. Perhaps I'm talking a bit too long, but I think it's going to be a kind of a mixture of this change, not change, and the economy.
Well, John, go ahead, John.
Just on that point, really, we were in the green room. We were chatting before tonight, and you made a point, which was that the people in Britain, the parties in Britain, were going to have to go in a particular direction because that's where their potential voters were. And it's perfectly true, as Istvan says, that the coalition of which has been brought together by Tisza is making a conservative case. You don't worry too much; things are not going to be that different. And yet, of course, if they actually win a lot of left-wing votes, as well as having some left-wing advisors, over time they're going to go in at that direction because that's where their voters will be. And that, I think, is an important reason for caution, which I think Fidesz is playing up. Yeah.
There's a very interesting pattern that's emerged because you've talked about risk and this being decided about risk, and maybe perhaps it's economic risk, perhaps it's reputational, and so on. But I've been thinking about it, and this is a question for Ralph, I suppose. That there is a paradox, I suppose, with the government, that on the one hand, they have been around for so long that anything has been, in a sense, on their watch. But at the same time, you have a situation where, given we're in risky times, there's a Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, and I think we do now live in interesting times, you kind of want a steady hand of someone at least knows how things can go, some experience. So there's a strange paradox, it seems. What do you make of that, Ralph?
Well, the question about risk is always whether the risk that you see is also seen by others. I'm a regular smoker, and I've constantly been told this is very risky, but it doesn't make me stop doing it because I don't see the risk as dramatic as maybe others do. And it reminded me of an election that took place in the German federal elections of 2002-2003, right, where then Chancellor Gerhard Schröder ran a very, very similar to now what Viktor Orbán is doing, a very strong anti-war campaign. This was shortly before the United States invaded Iraq. But of course, Schröder had the advantage that the conservatives who were in opposition then were campaigning on actually participating in the war in Iraq. So this was a clear dichotomy where one party said we want to support the US, the other party said we don't want to support the US, we don't want to go to war. The problem I see, going back to what Henry said about risk, is if the argument has been, and what I've seen in the billboards in Budapest particularly, but also in the countryside, that if you vote for TISA, that's going to be the risk that you'll be dragged into a war. Are the people believing that risk? Like, do they say, okay, it is true, if there is a new prime minister, then the risk is really high? Or do people say, yeah, the risk might be slightly higher, but it's not as dramatic as, for example, it was in Germany in 2002, where one party actively said we would actively send German troops and German aircraft and all these kind of things. As far as I know, and correct me immediately if I'm wrong, I don't think that any member of the TISA party has said that. So they are painted as the potential pro-war party, but they themselves, I don't think, have represented themselves as such. Maybe they are, right? I don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but that makes it more difficult. So again, the German case was easy because Gerhard Schröder could say, look at Edmund Stoiber, who was then the leading candidate of the Conservatives. He said in this and this and this and this interview, we have to stand with our allies and we have to support them in Iraq and so on and so on and so on. I think this is much more difficult in the case of Fidesz and TISA to kind of put or kind of to say, okay, this risk is really real and it's probably going to happen very soon.
Well, actually, just to jump in here, I think some of his members of European Parliament actually did say something similar, and they certainly did go into the Parliament with Ukrainian flags on their T-shirts. So,
all right, then is it? Because then all bets are off.
Sometimes elections are decided by luck and timing. And TISA has all kinds of problems, but it has gotten one thing very lucky right. It is an old enough party and has become well organized enough that it has a party infrastructure that is surprising for a party only 2 years old. But it's not so old that it has collected barnacles and a bad reputation because they haven't had the responsibility of government. Now, to many people, that's a risk, but you can point to fears about TISA, but you cannot point to anything that they've done that really scares people in reality because they haven't had anything to really do. So that's the problem facing Fidesz. Now, as for the future, it is very difficult for a party in power 16 consecutive years to run a positive campaign about the future. Because, as you said, they own the reality on the ground. But here's the problem. You have to have some kind of positive campaign. All of the campaigns that have been mentioned, including the Gerhard Schröder campaign, Gerhard Schröder had a positive message. And, you know, I've looked at, after Henry mentioned it, I've looked at stuff online. You have to strain to see the idealistic, positive message about, let's say, the economy that Fidesz is putting forward. Maybe you've seen stuff I haven't seen, but I haven't seen it. So you have a campaign about risk and fear, and yes, you have to preserve the benefits that we have, the family benefits, the price fuel caps, all of that. But that's not a soaring idealistic message. And at the end of a campaign, even an incumbent party in office for many years does some of that. Well, here we are Thursday, and I still haven't seen it. So there's the challenge. I think, again, I don't know who's going to win, but Fidesz increasingly seems to me to be fighting the last war, not the war for this year and this election.
So speaking of these sort of battles and so on, I mean, there's a few issues where there's a lot of divergence in opinion, obviously, and where each side are almost suggesting the other side are doing something. So one is electoral interference, and I'm curious about the panel's perspective on what is electoral interference. I mean, you hear both sides have said that Brussels are interfering, or you hear occasionally Russia's interfering, these sorts of things. What do you think the truth is, Ishan? Or anyone else, Henry?
Well, thank you for giving me the most difficult question. Well, look, I mean, what is interference? So, if I'm devil's advocate, GD Vance coming in is interference. But isn't Brussels not giving money to Hungary for more than 4 years? Actually, the previous election, that sounds like a much bigger interference. or Zelensky not repairing the oil pipeline and closing down oil. Seems to be an even bigger interference. So for me, it's strange that the Hungarian election has become this hotbed. So we can talk a bit about that, why that is, and I kind of know why it is. But in a sense, it's kind of shocking why everybody is talking about this. So, I mean, did people talk about the Czech elections this much when they happened last year? It's a similar size country, similar GDP-wise. I don't think anybody, I mean, I'm not saying anybody cared, but certainly there was not this much kind of an attention on the election. I'm purposely not saying the Slovenian elections a month ago, when was it, because Slovenia is a much smaller country. So you can see that Hungary plays this kind of very important role for the conservative right, and I would like to say that for the left as well, because I really think that in some extent the left has elevated us, because when I started working on these issues, I mean 2013-14, the left already saw Orbán as this terrible devil who's doing this and that, and I didn't really see that in the conservative movement back then. I mean, they didn't really know about this. So I think actually the left started that elevation, funny enough, and then luckily our conservative friends also noticed a lot of the good things coming in. But for me, what is kind of strange is this attention on this election, which I think is just too surprising, and I'm not too happy about it in one extent. So, I mean, a lot of the things which are happening now, where it seems that some of our friends in Europe are actually listening to us and publishing kind of Secret Service stuff on the Hungarian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. I think that's highly problematic, and I understand if they don't like the government here, but did Hungary do anything like that, this kind of a breach of trust? I don't think so. I think we have been, despite what a lot of people say, very good and strong NATO allies. I mean, that's actually rewarding us, because America is at least not doing this now under this administration. But I think we have been pretty good EU members as well, despite what a lot of people like to think. So if we talk about interference, I think there's much more coming from the opposition side or the European Union side. I think that's much more tangible than let's say, G.D. Vance coming here and giving a good speech, which I'm happy about, don't get me wrong. But I think that's more a show of support than actual interference. But I'm sad about it, because I can't understand why they would do this. Why would they kind of specify Hungary? And as I said, I mean, this can destroy a whole alliance, this kind of attitude, and going after the foreign minister and the prime minister. And Zelensky actually even threatened Orbán, saying that he will send soldiers to his home if he will not vote the next package. So,
Istvan, I can summarize some of your frustrations very briefly. I can say this because I'm an American. What you mourn, and I do to some extent, is the Americanization of Hungarian politics. I've been to this rodeo. I've lived this rodeo in the United States. Welcome to this neighborhood. You're not going back, unfortunately.
Can I just expand?
Hang on a second.
Well, I'm not changing the topic. It's just more to expand the question a little bit. But well, go ahead, John. But I just wanted to expand it a little bit.
Sure. Well, I mean, look, in the last month or two, you've had distinguished, important political figures in Western European politics and in the United States, journalistic figures of distinction. And they have been saying things like, it is not possible for Fidesz to win this election honestly. Therefore, if Fidesz wins, it can only have been done by trickery. Now, as Henry said, when you're talking to serious people in Hungarian politics, everybody says, yes, the vote is fair. The complications of trying to rig it are impossible to solve. So there is no real prospect, of Fidesz losing and then managing to pull votes from nowhere. And secondly, I would say it's inconceivable that Orbán would refuse to respect the result of the election. Those things have been said again and again. As I say, there have been two election campaigns. There's been the Hungarian election campaign conducted before the voters, and that, it seems to me, I mean, election campaigns are never noble affairs. But nonetheless, it's been more or less honest and clear. The election campaign that's been waged at an international level has been completely dishonest, one-sided, unlike the speech by Vice President Vance, which was clear and open, candid, a choice of one side. The decision, for example, of the European Court of Justice to delay releasing its decision over which will almost certainly, we all believe, reject the Hungarian Parliament's attempt to prevent sexual propaganda being delivered to young children. That's kind of interference by delay, by obfuscation. That has been, in my view, disgraceful. And the picture given of Hungary and of Hungarian politics during this period to foreigners and to the, in a sense, world opinion has been so misleading as to be completely fraudulent. And I think we should be angry about that, however relaxed we should be about the result of the election before and in front of Hungarians.
So I just want to, István touched on the fact that of almost being bemused by how much the Hungarian election is featuring internationally. It's the event at the moment. It's what everyone's talking about. You go on YouTube, it truly is. I mean, my entire YouTube feed right now is video essays from all different sides talking about the Hungarian elections. Most people doing the videos can't pronounce any names in Hungarian, but it's interesting to see. Anyway, but my question here, to pivot off this idea, we talked about interference. Obviously, interference is about foreign actors intervening. But the real question is, why are they intervening? Why do you think, and we maybe start with Ralph here on this, why do you think the Hungarian election is being seen as this event of global import? This is a small country. It's 9.5 million people. Why is the world paying attention like they are? What is at stake?
I mean, no government is perfect, and that's true for Hungary as it is for any other country. But there's one thing that Hungary has done, the Hungarian government has done, and for which I'm eternally grateful, the Hungarian taxpayer has done, which is the creation and the financing of a conservative ecosystem that did not exist in Europe. And I think this is, for some at least, the underlying reason why both this election draws so much attention, because there is some hope, at least of those who are on the other side of the ideological aisle, that then you can dry up that kind of support. I mean, without direct or indirect, and I don't think I'm stepping on anybody's toes here, without the direct and indirect support by the Hungarian government. And again, I say this with a tremendous amount of gratitude. The Hungarian taxpayer, I think neither my institution nor the Danube Institute nor many other institutions would exist in the very form they exist today. I'm not saying they wouldn't be there, but not in as powerful a condition as they are today. Our sister organization, the MCC Brussels, right, they do a lot of very interesting, very good work. This could not be done, and The Economist actually had an entire article recently about the right-wing ecosystem, how terrible, because there is one conservative think tank, one real conservative think tank now in Brussels, and the idea is if you can take down the Hungarians a notch, right? If you basically dry up this new conservative ecosystem, then it's going to be smooth riding in the future, and this is, I think, one of the main reasons. I mean, I believe that also Hungarians will be very disappointed if Fidesz loses. All of a sudden Hungary will be treated just as any other country of that size. So I think the kind of international attention it got in the very recent past, all of this is going to disappear. But I think this is one of the main reasons for this kind of interference. Because, again, I want to say this very, very clearly. The Hungarian taxpayer, the Hungarian government took it upon them to say there needs to be, not just on a national level, but on a European and potentially international level, a credible, truly conservative, right-leaning think tank or think tank ecosphere. And this is what they created, with all its flaws and all its troubles, but overall this, I think, is one of the main reasons.
István, and then Henry.
I just wanted to make the point here that it's not just the ecosystem. I think you have a conservative government who's actually been implementing conservative policies, and with that destroying some of the myths the left has kind of built their policies on. For example, migration is good and you cannot stop it, so you should just allow it. Or, you have to have progressive taxation because that's fair, and, without that, low-income people will be very bad and will never vote for you. No, so he implemented a lot of these conservative policies, from taxation to stopping migration to family support. Another thing, I mean, You cannot help your own people to have more kids. It's just impossible. And he's, showing that it is possible, and they don't like it because a lot of the things they have been telling us for 20 years that it's impossible, it's not working, it is working. And if it's working in Hungary, it could work in the Czech Republic, in Austria, in America, in the UK, and that's why they don't like it, because there's only one kind of outlier. They have to get rid of it because it shows an example.
Well, I agree with Istvan, but there is a point that you have to acknowledge. There is a fine line between courage and taking real risks with your political future. Viktor Orbán should be given credit for pugnaciously and vigorously presenting his case and his criticisms of Brussels, the vast majority of which I agree with. However, in doing so, he took a different strategy than, let's say, Meloni in Italy, who has alternated between sticking with her principles, muting them, and working with EU as much as she possibly can. That was a choice on her part. We'll see how that works out. Viktor Orbán, for better or for ill politically, made that famous illiberal democracy speech. And I know, because I've heard it in Brussels from very important people, that was like lighting a fire. And I think it earned him the permanent enmity of the ruling class in Brussels and, frankly, the elites in capitals all around the world. And it has become personal. In the meetings where Viktor Orbán talks with other European leaders, where the media is not there, I mean, he does a very good imitation of sometimes what Donald Trump is like. And they react viscerally and personally to him in a way that European leaders don't normally react with each other. So this is a blood feud. Let's be honest about it. And I'm not saying Viktor Orbán made the right call or the wrong call, but he certainly knew the risks that he was taking with the approach and the style that he was adopting.
Henry.
I want to just step back and take a look at the last 15 to 20 years. Is that if we were sitting here talking before the 2008 collapse, we would be talking about a global consensus that is internationalist, free migration of trade, the belief that China and the rest of the world will be made peaceful through trade, and a belief that the spread of progressive social values would slowly wear down traditional values but increase social cohesion. What we've seen is, over the last 20 years, all three of these things have failed, or at least failed for a large number of voters, and that has created what the elites in Brussels, in Wall Street, in Hollywood, in Washington, in the city in London, and any place where people have done well from that, are furious at, and that is the populist counter-revolution. Hungary was one of the first, if not the first place, to essentially declare that we are leading the counter-revolution to this, that we no longer believe purely in globalism, we no longer purely believe in the spread of progressive values, and quite the opposite, and we no longer think that internationalism will simply make the world safer, that actually we need to be standing up. Beating one of the global leaders of the counter-revolution is something that they believe will start to quash the counter-revolution. But they fail to understand that the reason this keeps growing is because they keep failing. The reason why, you take a look at French polls, the only person who can beat Bardella in the next election is the old, tired Edouard Philippe, who's arguably center-right, and that only by a couple of points. These elites think if they stamp down the leader, they will crush the movement, when it's, in fact, from the ground up, people themselves looking around and saying, what you told us 20 years ago isn't coming true, the system doesn't work for us, and we're going to make changes. So for them, this is, they believe, the start of suppressing the peasants' revolt. But in fact, they can't kill enough of the peasants, and the peasants will find a new leader, and perhaps an even more skillful one.
Or actually, maybe, to use Star Wars language, the Empire has struck back.
So it's funny you mentioned this. You mentioned this idea of being sort of courageous, but at what risk? And I've been thinking recently that many people in progressive causes recently, people say you're so brave. But it's not actually brave if everyone agrees with you and praises you for it. It's actually brave when everyone is criticizing you for it. So I wonder if you look at what Orbán has done in the last 15 years. For many years, he was the singular voice, the only voice. Now, as Ralph has said, there's now more people rallying around with the same, having almost like an icebreaker, coming behind it. So I'm wondering if that sort of having that sort of courage to say something when it's unpopular, to create, as you say, a blood feud, is that not just part and parcel of breaking from a consensus? And is that not perhaps necessary when the consensus is itself the problem?
Look, win or lose, Viktor Orbán will have changed Europe, or certainly set in motion a change in Europe that will last for many, many years. And that is not something that is to be taken lightly. But there's always a danger with a leader who steps on the world stage. And in this case, Hungary has an outsized role on the world stage because of the Fidesz government. There's always a danger that by paying attention to international disputes, by taking sides, by calling people out, that you sometimes can be perceived as taking your eye off the ball. And the ball, in the case of many average Hungarians, for whom this conversation would be alien and not particularly relevant to their lives, the ball is, as Henry started out in his opening remarks, what about my life, my family, my prospects, and what have you done for me lately? And that danger of being a world figure, an outsized world figure, but forgetting the neighborhoods in rural and suburban Hungary and Budapest, that even if you haven't done so, they think they've been neglected.
John.
Let me put it this way. John said about 2 or 3 interventions ago that there was almost no kind of nobility and grace in the Fidesz campaign. And of course, a campaign, as I say, elections are very rarely places in which nobility and grace are the star center of things. But surely, one of the elements of one of the graceful and idealistic elements in this, although also not simply idealistic but highly practical, is the desire to try to promote the family on the one hand, and secondly, children on the other. The future of Hungary will be very bleak indeed if Hungarians don't have children. And the future of many countries in the world, South Korea and so many others, those countries will disappear in a relatively short time on current demographic projections. So this is a very, very key element. He has taken a series of bold and dramatic elements on those issues. Another one, take housing. That is recognized across the world to be a major flashpoint, partly because of immigration, when you produce more people needing houses than you have houses. And yet, the number of Hungarians who own their own homes is very remarkable. It's 91%. At least that's the figure that everybody gives me. Now, that tells me that on a very practical, idealistic level, the Hungarian government has done very serious things. And that would also tell me there must be some people there who say to themselves, I wouldn't have this house, I wouldn't have this family this soon if it weren't for these policies. And we can't neglect the gratitude of those voters in our expectations.
I grant you that, but the family policies, most of which I would support, haven't moved the dial much. And they've been in place for several years running. And, give me a case in which intense government intervention in promoting natalism or the growth of families with these policies has actually moved the dial. Maybe in a generation, but not so far and not now.
Well, let us concede that it's true that the dial hasn't moved much. But before these policies were introduced, or as they were being introduced, the government conceded that this would be a very long struggle because the decision to have
That's not what they told me in 2022.
The decision to have children is not simply something about financial incentives and possibilities, though that's true. It is, in a sense, a whole of society operation. It's if you have a great many influence in a society deterring the decision to have children, then it's going to take a long period of time before government policies can move that dial. It did move the dial, by the way, a bit, but not as much as people hoped. But nonetheless, there are beneficiaries out there, and those voters count too.
I just also want to say that, you might think that actually in the past couple of years the birth rate did go down again. But if you look at the overall European average, Hungary is now one of the best in Europe because all the other countries went down much worse. So without these policies, I think Hungary would be if it's South Korea or something like that. So I think it depends on how you measure the success of these policies. But even without that, statistics show that about 200,000 babies were born because of these policies. And you have hundreds of thousands of people who benefited from them. So I wouldn't rule out that demographic. As I said, I think in 2022 it did help in places in the agglomeration where people are not necessarily very conservative or Fidesz voters, but they did feel that they are in this house, they pay less taxes because they have 3 kids or 2 kids. So I don't know, let's see. But I think that they could play a role because hundreds of thousands of people have been beneficiaries of these policies.
I mean, Ralph, just as a quick add-on, because this is a very interesting topic, and we talk a lot about migration policy, in particular when it comes to Hungary. But if you look at polls and movements, which worries me a lot, and this worries me, by the way, in other European countries as well, particularly young people, they tend to leave. And I think this is a very, very worrying trend. Again, in other countries as well, but it is also the case in Hungary. Like if you have an education/indoctrination, whatever you want to call it, but if you have a certain skill set and you're under the age of 25, if you look at the polls, many people say that they want to leave Hungary. I mean, I'm not saying this is because of the government. I'm not trying to shift any blame, but this goes back to what you said, John, right? That apparently the expectation of an economic future in this country, or to earn what people think they are worth, right? It seems that many believe that they have better options elsewhere. And as John also said correctly, I mean, the comparison with Poland is not particularly flattering. Poland, one could say, okay, they basically had an economic miracle going on since the 1990s. They did so well that it might be unfair to compare Hungary to Poland. But, well, it is, I think, a fair comparison. So,
John, can I...
Yeah, but I mean, right, you're right, but you have GDP per capita, right?
Oh, please. That's not.
Comparing us to Slovakia or Czech Republic is more realistic.
Well, okay, I'll compare it to the Czech Republic.
The Czech Republic is doing better as well, I agree.
Yes, okay.
But there's a lot of historic things as well there.
So can I ask a question on that, though? So I'm British, and for successive governments now, cross-party, we've had people in power who are technocratic managers, but they don't seem to have any guiding vision. Now, obviously, you can critique any policy for the implementation of virtually all policies, and certainly, I think your critiques are fair. But but do you not see there's a certain value in having a vision that one is trying to implement, regardless of how well it is implemented? Because I know in the UK we are completely lacking in that kind of someone who has a sense that there is. That there is an end, not just the means.
Oh, the secularization of Great Britain is a tragedy. The place is becoming value-free in many official functions of government. So Hungary has a great argument to make that we have to pay attention to our traditions, to our values, we have to promote the family, all of that. But if you don't keep your eye on the prosperity ball, a lot of that is discounted when people go to vote. Because they don't necessarily fear, because of TISA's very rapid rise and its lack of a record, that all of that is going to be at risk suddenly if Fidesz isn't forming the government. So it's a paradox. I give Fidesz full credit for having a vision, but I have to tell you, this campaign, from what I've seen, is a lot more negative and doesn't reflect that vision very very accurately. What is reflected accurately is, yes, I see the pro-family policies, I see the price caps, I see all of that. I don't see a path to prosperity in the next 4 years. And the path that I was shown in 2022, when I met with all of these government ministers, and they assured me that it would lead to prosperity, it just hasn't happened. Yeah. So they were wrong 4 years ago. The question an average voter might ask is, give me a path, give me the plan of how we're going to move from stagnation to something better in 4 years. Yeah. Many people will accept Fidesz's explanation, but a lot of people still have lots of questions. Yeah.